Welcome to Worlds of Imagination. I'm Delaney O'Shea, and today I'll be presenting Magic's Gravity, the power of representation in science fiction and fantasy youth literature. Diverse representation is crucial for all types of readers in every genre, but the genres of science fiction and fantasy offer something unique, entire worlds built at the whim of an author, or powers and tools that defy the logic of our current reality. How do these story components function in terms of multiculturalism? At the end of this presentation, it is my hope that you will be able to 1. Understand the unique potential of science fiction fantasy, which I may refer to as SFF for the remainder of my discussion, for exploring cultures and social issues. 2. Identify the ways that children's and young adult SFF approaches topics of multiculturalism. And finally, recognize the importance of diverse and accurate representation in SFF youth literature. Let's begin by exploring speculative fiction and what it offers. Science fiction and fantasy novels have two options for setting. These stories can either take place in our existing world by altering the rules which we have come to understand, as in the use of magical powers within fantasy, or perhaps a change to the physical environment for science fiction, or they can be set in entirely new fictional places. A fantasy book could be set in Oklahoma, for example, or a science fiction book could be set on a planet unheard of, galaxies away from our Earth. But what does this mean in the scope of narrative opportunity? The answer is a lot. According to Isvind, the fantastical and imaginative can be used to breach subjects of representation, cultures, norms, and stereotypes. SFF literature allows for discussion and analysis of cultural, sexual, gendered, traditional, and religious differences with some distance from reality. Friedman suggests that exploring new ideas, bounded only by human imagination, encourages creative thinking and might even foster acceptance of scientific understanding. She also purports that, quote, speculative fiction may provide children and teens with tools for contemplating the universe's possibilities, including uncomfortable ones, and developing resilience, end quote. Lewis claims that diversity in these genres can offer a non-confrontational, non-preachy form of social justice teaching. In yet another vein, Lamb and Johnson focus on the use of maps in SFF books. In the middle of the poster, you'll find a map of Alagasia, the fictional land from Christopher Paolini's Inheritance cycle series. According to Lamb and Johnson, we, quote, can use the maps in popular books for children and young adults to jumpstart 21st century skills related to analyzing primary sources, using online map and satellite image resources, and constructing maps, end quote. Not only do SFF books offer a unique perspective for discussions about social themes, but these documents mean that they can extend an option for integrated learning about geography and another form of textual literacy. A nonprofit organization from Savannah, Georgia, called the Deep Center, runs a writing program for secondary students called Block by Block. Traditionally, this program focused on creative nonfiction, realistic prose, and poetry. But when a student named Max requested that he be able to write science fiction, the program was re-examined. Stephanie Tolliver, quote, a Black female doctoral student who studies representations of and responses to adolescents of color in science fiction and fantasy texts, end quote, planned for an experimental writing workshop. Students observed their communities and the social issues within them. After researching these issues, they predicted what they might look like in the future and how they might change. Then they began to write. According to Tolliver and Miller, quote, SF became an imaginative framework through which students could interrogate identity positions and analyze oppressive hierarchies in the world. It was also a way for students to express their ideas about the changes they wished to see in the world they inhabit, end quote. We've seen the potential for SFF. Now let's look at the historical frameworks of these genres. Within the world of published literature, SFF has often been exclusionary, barring from entry into the fantastic those who are not white, cisgender, heterosexual, and without disabilities. However, fantasy is usually built upon the inclusion of fictional races, and many suggest that science fiction emerged as a response to imperialism. So how does this work? I'll use two examples, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien and The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Baker describes these stories as functioning through the use of fairly strict racial categories. In The Hobbit, quote, dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk, with a great idea of the value of money. Goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted, End quote. Conversely, quote, elves know a lot and are wondrous folk for news, end quote. Baker also discusses her skepticism of a speaker's claim that Lewis employs characters entirely, quote, other than ourselves, end quote. She notes that the beavers, who the Pevensey siblings encounter, eat familiar food and have sewing machines. Even with fauns and dryads and powerful lions, Baker parses the story down to its foundation. Quote, although Narnia has an effectively multiracial population, it can be ruled well by only one race, the human one, end quote. She questions the tendency for fantasy books to emulate the European medieval world, with castles and swords and, quote, Merlin-esque magic, end quote. On the left of the poster, you'll find some fan art of Bree Matthews from Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. Legendborn takes this very traditional fantasy system, complete with knights and merlins, and turns it on its head by adding Bree, African American history, and a type of magic called root. Why not worlds inspired by the cultures and mythologies and folklores of other populations? Naidu and Dahlin recall that enslaved African Americans, quote, use spirituals, trickster tales, and freedom stories as metaphoric devices. It was through these stories that they protested the injustice and inhumanity of slavery and gleaned information about escape on the Underground Railroad, end quote. In the same way, for example, Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi uses Nigerian folklore and mythology to address racism and police brutality. Though SFF offers opportunity for addressing themes like prejudice, discrimination, and social change, it can also act as a safe harbor where social realities like racism are not afforded textual space. Baker questions whether diverse characters in fictional worlds might, quote, help us dodge the issues that confront us in a less comfortable way in the real world, end quote. SFF may refer to our world's consciousness of racial difference with the express purpose of showing that it can or should be irrelevant, but in some cases where the politics of inclusivity is not in the foreground of the story, the racial attributes of non-white heroes are rendered virtually invisible. Is this positive or negative? It seems it could be both. In Slay by Brittany Morris, the main character Kiera creates her own fantasy world in the form of a video game, meant only for Black people, where their characters can duel with cards inspired by various aspects of Black culture. This game allows players to customize their avatar's appearances and also avoid an online gaming community where they might be subjected to the same racism that they experience in the real world. While this is still a conversation with her friends and family outside of Slay, within the game, players are just able to be. As someone enamored with science fiction and fantasy, and especially diverse stories within these genres, I was disappointed when I had trouble finding online resources dedicated to this specific area. If there are data and statistics focusing upon diversity in these genres, I did not find them. But there are easy ways to navigate through more general resources for the purpose of finding SFF content. Diversity in YA is a website that was created by two Asian American authors of YA fantasy and science fiction books, Melinda Lowe and Cindy Pon. A quick search for either of these genres on the website will pull up a number of blog posts about the topic of diversity, along with some reading lists. Unfortunately, the site is no longer active, so you won't find any new content, but the three other sites I've included will function similarly, and they also contain book reviews and author Q&As. In conclusion, science fiction and fantasy, through their unique story elements, can offer either an escape from reality, discrimination, and injustice, or a means to explore these themes. Historically, these genres have proved to be exclusionary and otherizing, either failing to represent marginalized populations entirely, or demonizing peoples and cultures through the creation of fictional races. As Thomas states, quote, in addition to amplifying diverse fantasy, liberating the rest of the fantastic from its fear and loathing of darkness and dark others is essential, end quote. Solving these issues involves first confronting the existing canon of SFF literature, and then increasing the breadth and accuracy of representation included in the future of these genres. And finally, representation in youth SFF is important because children and teens deserve to see themselves and their cultures in books of every genre, no matter their reading preferences. Providing youth with a space in SFF means empowerment, inspiration for creativity, and a safe place for exploring social themes. Thank you for listening.